judge looked at my wife's attorney and asked one question, 7 words, and I watched 23 years of her carefully constructed lies collapse in about 40 seconds. I'm 64 years old. I worked for 31 years as a forensic accountant for the federal government, the kind of job where you learn to say nothing, document everything, and wait. My wife knew I worked with numbers. She did not know what kind. I never told her. Not because I was hiding something sinister. I just never thought it mattered. It mattered. My name is not important. What happened in that courtroom is, I'll start where it actually started, not where my wife said it started. We met in 1999 at a hardware store in Dayton, Ohio. She was buying paint. I was buying a new faucet head. She laughed at something I said. I can't even remember what, and I thought, this woman has warmth in her. That was the word I used in my head. Warmth. I was 41. I had been careful about love for most of my adult life, the way you're careful around things that can hurt you. I let my guard down for warmth. We married in 2001. She had a daughter from a previous relationship, 9 years old, gap-toothed, afraid of thunderstorms. I adopted her legally 2 years after the wedding. I coached her soccer team. I taught her to drive. I walked her down the aisle in 2018. She called me dad from the time she was 11, and I never once corrected her because there was nothing to correct. Then I had a stroke in February of 2021. It was minor, medically speaking. Left side weakness, some speech difficulty, 3 weeks of inpatient rehab, 6 months of outpatient. I recovered well. The doctors called it a good outcome. But something shifted in the house after that. Something I couldn't name at first. I chalked it up to fear. Hers, mine, both of ours. Strokes frighten people. They make everyone suddenly aware that time is finite. What I didn't know was that my wife had started making phone calls while I was still in the hospital. I found out about the first one 14 months later. She had called our bank, the joint account we'd held together since 2003, and told them I was incapacitated. That's the word the bank representative used when I eventually reviewed the records. Incapacitated. She had used my stroke as cover to shift signatory authority on several accounts to herself alone. The bank, to their credit, had flagged it internally, but had not stopped it. At the time, I was genuinely recovering. I was not reading documents closely. She brought things to me and I signed them. I trusted her. That's a hard sentence to write, but it's the true one. Over the next year and a half, approximately $340,000 moved through accounts I had access to on paper but not in practice. Some of it went to home improvement projects that I knew about. Most of it went to places I did not recognize until I started looking. I started looking in April of 2023. I want to be precise about why, because people have asked. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no single thing that made me suspicious. It was smaller than that. It was my wife telling me, very casually over dinner one night, that we weren't in a position to help our grandson with his first month's rent. He was 22 and starting a new job 3 states away and needed $800 to bridge a gap. $800. And my wife said with a fork in her hand and barely looking up from her plate that we just couldn't do it right now. I had been a federal forensic accountant for 3 decades. I knew what our accounts held, or I thought I did. I said nothing at dinner. I said nothing for 3 days. Then I sat down at my computer and began to look at what was actually there. It took me 6 weeks to understand the full picture. Some of what I found I recognized immediately: transfers, withdrawals, relocations. Some of it I had to trace through third parties. My wife had been moving money methodically, not recklessly. She was smart about it. In a different context, I might have admired the patience it required. She had opened 2 accounts I didn't know existed, one in her name only. One jointly with her brother who lived in Scottsdale and whom I had always found vaguely unpleasant but never hostile. The jointly held account with her brother had, by the time I found it, a balance of just over $190,000. I did not confront her. This is the part that people who hear this story always struggle with. I did not say a word. I went to work the following Monday. I came home, I ate dinner, I watched television, and I continued doing that for 8 more months while I built what I needed to build. I am a forensic accountant. I have testified in federal court 11 times. I know how evidence works. I know what a judge needs to see and what a judge cannot dismiss. I was not going to walk into a confrontation armed with suspicion. I was going to walk into a courtroom armed with documentation. I retained an attorney in November of 2023, a family law specialist who had been recommended to me by a colleague I trusted. I drove to her office on a Tuesday afternoon and I laid out a manila folder on her desk with 2 years of financial records, organized by date, account, and transaction type. She was quiet for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, "How long have you been putting this together?" I told her. She said, "Your wife doesn't know, you know." I said, "No." She said, "Good. Let's keep it that way." My wife filed for divorce in January of 2024. She filed first, which told me she had her own timeline. Her petition cited irreconcilable differences and, notably, financial abandonment, the claim that I had withdrawn from our shared finances and left her to manage everything alone. It was an almost admirable inversion of what had actually happened. She accused me of the things she had been doing to me. I received the petition on a Thursday. I read it carefully. I set it on the kitchen counter. I made coffee. My daughter, our daughter, the one I walked down the aisle, called me that evening. She had already spoken to her mother. She was upset, which I understood. She said things that were hard to hear. She said I had checked out after my stroke. She said her mother had been holding everything together for years. She said she didn't want to take sides, but that she needed me to understand what her mother had been going through. I listened. I did not defend myself. I said I loved her, and that when the time was right, I would show her something, and I asked her to trust me until then. She said she would try. Her husband, my son-in-law, called me 2 days later. He was quieter about it. He said he didn't know what to believe and that he was worried about me. I told him I was fine. He said, "You seem fine and that worries me a little." He's a perceptive man. I've always liked him for that. The divorce proceedings stretched over 6 months. My wife's attorney was aggressive, well-prepared, and operating on the assumption that I was a man in his 60s who had coasted through a long marriage on autopilot and couldn't account for missing money because he'd never paid close attention to it. This assumption was the foundation of their entire case. It was also the assumption I had spent 8 months carefully arranging them to make. At the first formal deposition, my wife testified that she had been the primary financial manager of our household for the last several years, that I had disengaged after my health scare, and that the accounts she had opened independently were a necessary response to my instability. Her attorney presented bank records. They were accurate as far as they went. They showed my wife managing accounts. They showed transfers. What they did not show, what her attorney apparently did not know to look for, was the documentation I had assembled alongside those same records, showing exactly where the money had gone and why. The hearing that mattered was on a Wednesday morning in September. I wore a gray suit. I'd had it for 15 years. My wife was across the room in something I didn't recognize, something new, and I noticed she looked at me the way she'd been looking at me for about 2 years, like I was furniture that had outlived its usefulness. Her attorney made her opening argument. She referenced my prolonged disengagement. She said the word incapacitated again, borrowed from that early bank call, as though saying it enough times would make it permanently true. She described my wife as a woman who had carried the household through a medical crisis and years of emotional absence, who had taken practical steps to protect the family's financial security. My wife nodded along. She had the expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment and found it going according to plan. Then the judge asked to see the financial documentation. My attorney submitted our exhibit binder. It was thorough, 41 pages. The judge took approximately 12 minutes to review the first section before he looked up at my wife's attorney and asked, simply, "Counsel, are you aware of your client's joint account with her brother?" 7 words. Or 9, depending on how you count. My wife's attorney paused. A short pause but noticeable. She said she was aware of the account. The judge said, "And are you prepared to account for the $190,000 currently held in that account, given that the records here indicate those funds originated in the marital estate?" Another pause. Longer this time. I did not look at my wife. I looked at my hands, which were folded on the table in front of me. I had learned over 31 years of federal work that the moment you've been building toward does not require your reaction to confirm it. It happens whether you watch it or not. I heard my wife's attorney say she would need a recess to confer with her client. The judge granted 15 minutes. In the hallway, my attorney touched my arm and said quietly, "That's it. That's the case." We went back in. My wife's attorney asked for a continuance to gather additional documentation. The judge denied it. He said the documentation present was sufficient to raise serious questions about the characterization of the marital estate and that he was referring the matter to the County Financial Crimes Unit for review. My wife's face at that moment was something I will not describe in detail. I'll say only that it was the face of someone who has been very sure of a thing for a long time and has just discovered they were wrong. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. The settlement was substantially different from what my wife's original petition had sought. The jointly held account with her brother was considered a marital asset improperly removed. My wife's brother, I'm told by people who follow these things, retained an attorney of his own not long afterward. My daughter called me the week after the settlement. She said she had gone through the documentation my attorney had sent over. My attorney had made sure she received a copy, per my request, and she had spent 3 days reading it. She was quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she said, "Dad, I didn't know." I said I knew she didn't. She said, "I said things to you that weren't fair." I said, "You said them because you loved your mother and you were scared." "I understand that." She cried a little. I let her. She asked me why I hadn't told her sooner, why I hadn't defended myself when she called that first time, why I just listened and said I'd show her when the time was right. I told her the truth. I said that if I had started talking before I had everything in order, it would have become a he said, she said, and she was already leaning in one direction, and I couldn't afford to push her further away with accusations I couldn't yet prove. I said I needed her to come to the truth on her own terms, with documentation in hand, not because her old man had talked her into it. She was quiet again. Then she said, "That's the most patient thing I've ever heard." I told her patience isn't always a virtue. Sometimes it's just the only tool that works. My son-in-law took me to lunch the following week. He ordered a burger and didn't say much for the first 20 minutes. Then he said, "I want you to know I never stopped thinking something was off. I just didn't have any way to prove it." I told him that was more than enough. He's a good man. My daughter chose well. I am not going to tell you my life is entirely clean on the other side of this. It isn't. 23 years is a long time. There are things I miss that have nothing to do with the woman she turned out to be. I miss the person I believed I was building something with, and those two things are not the same, but they're tangled up together in ways I can't always separate. Some mornings that's a heavier weight than I expect. I don't pretend otherwise. But I know what I know, and I know that when the moment came, I walked into that courtroom with 41 pages of documented truth, and I sat quietly while someone tried to convince a judge that I was a man who didn't pay attention. 31 years as a federal forensic accountant. I paid attention. I kept every receipt, every transfer record, every bank statement going back 11 years. I had organized them in a system I designed myself, color-coded by account, cross-referenced by date. My wife had lived in this house for 23 years, and she did not know that the filing cabinet in the back of my home office, the one she'd once asked about and I'd said was just old work documents, contained a record of every significant financial movement we had ever made together. Old work documents. That wasn't entirely untrue. There are things I would do differently. I would have paid closer attention earlier, not to the money, but to the small dishonesties. The ones I noticed and filed away and told myself were not worth making an issue of. A marriage has a texture, and if you're patient and attentive, you can feel when the texture changes. I felt it change, maybe 3 or 4 years before the stroke. I should have asked questions then. I didn't, because I was tired and I trusted her and I thought, this is just what long marriages do. They settle. They get quiet. Not all quiet is the same, it turns out. There's the quiet of two people who are comfortable together, and there's the quiet of a person doing something they don't want you to know about. I had confused the two for longer than I should have. My daughter came over last month for Sunday dinner. She brought my grandson, who is doing well in his new job and has since paid back his first month's rent, to me directly, because he found out I had quietly covered the $800 his grandmother had said we couldn't spare. He didn't have to do that. He did it anyway. He's got good instincts, that kid. We ate and we talked, and at one point my daughter reached across the table and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. She didn't have to. I have been a quiet man for most of my adult life. People have sometimes mistaken that for passivity or absence or not caring. I have let them, mostly. The accounting always comes out eventually. The ledger has a way of balancing. It just sometimes takes longer than you'd like.